All right, well, hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Professor Bennett Marquez, and I am an associate professor of law at the UConn Law School and the newly appointed director of our Center on Community Safety, Policing, and Inequality, which is a great honor. The mission of the center, broadly speaking, hopefully some of you gotten a chance to see the website, and we'll post some more information at the end of this event today. But the mission broadly is to think more expansively about the goals of the criminal justice system, and to try to take some of the theoretical insights that we cultivate in our scholarship at the law school across the university, and most importantly in the classroom, and sort of bring those insights down to earth and to bear on real world reform efforts on the ground across the state, and especially in the Hartford area. The center is still very much in its infancy. It really kind of came to life this year. Our website just launched. And so that means we're at a really exciting time. There's lots of possible directions. It's very embryonic. And we would really kind of love to hear from all of you about programmatic ideas and possibilities. This is very much a situation where, as academics, we have certain strengths that we bring, but that we don't know what we don't know, and we would love to learn more. Obviously this event is taking place remotely, which is somewhat unfortunate in the sense that I would have loved to gotten to meet all of you, and I'm sure my co-participants feel the same way. But the flip side is that we're able to reach a much larger audience, and folks can kind of tune in over their lunch hour. And so I don't know exactly whom I'm speaking to at this precise moment, but it's a wide variety. There's a lot of alumni, there's a lot of folks from community organizations, all manner of sort of practicing lawyers, other academics, perhaps some public officials. We're going to hear from one, or at least a recently retired one, in a moment here. So the bottom line is, please consider my door and the center's door open, get in touch, and hopefully today's event will inspire all of us to sort of think about the questions that the center is really trying to focus on going forward. So with that, it's a real delight to introduce the group of participants today. Our keynote speech for this kickoff event is going to be by Professor Bennett Capers, Fordham Law School. Before teaching at Fordham, he taught at a variety of other schools as well. He has a kind of a long, storied career. He, in addition to teaching at Fordham, also directs their Center on Race, Law, and Justice. And I know he's planning to speak a little bit today about the role that law schools can kind of play in reform. And I'm especially excited to hear his thoughts on that. Before he went into law teaching, he was a federal prosecutor for about a decade in the Southern District of New York. So has a lot of on the ground sort of experience with criminal law and criminal justice institutions, behind him and the work that he does. He's a prolific writer. He's been published very, very widely in all of the top law reviews. And as somebody who is kind of a member of the various listservs and the conference circuit in this area, the areas that Professor Capers works in, I can say he's pretty much regarded universally as a rock star. He will then be joined in dialogue when he finishes with Justice Richard Palmer, a graduate of ours, class of 1977, who recently retired from the Connecticut Supreme Court. After graduating from law school, he clerked on the Second Circuit, and then had a kind of a long, hallowed career, mostly in public service, up until 1993, when he was appointed as an Associate Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, where he served for 27 years, which I think I have this right. I think it's the longest term for a sitting Supreme Court Justice in the state of Connecticut, at least in the 20th century. The history was a little bit muddled when I tried to verify this, but I think he's definitely sat longer than anybody since 1900 or thereabouts. So real kind of magisterial public servant for the state. And we're really delighted to have him here to be in dialogue with Professor Capers and maybe give something of a more Connecticut specific perspective on some of the issues that Professor Capers plans to discuss. And then once they have an opportunity to go back and forth themselves for a bit and tease things out, they will be joined by our three tremendous student fellows at the center. We have two 2Ls, Mumina Egal and Bryce Simmons, and one 3L, Shane Russell. And so you'll get to kind of meet them later on in the program, and then they will join the fray, and hopefully a very lively discussion will ensue or will continue. So with that, I'm going to open it up, and so we maximize time for the actual meat of this, and we get to hear from Professor Capers. And Professor Capers, please take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks, Professor Brennan Marquez, for that warm and I'll say generous introduction. So when Professor Brennan Marquez emailed me a couple of months ago and told me about UConn's new Center on Community Safety, Policing, and Inequality, and asked me to deliver a kickoff lecture celebrating the occasion, I have to confess, two thoughts immediately ran through my head. The first thought was what an honor it was to receive such an invitation. And the second thought was, Lord, I must be getting old. The fact is that when I was first starting out as a law student, that seemed weird enough. I never envisioned that I'd become a law professor, let alone distinguished enough to give a kickoff lecture. But so be it. I was delighted to accept the invitation, even more so when Dean Nelson followed up with an email of her own urging me to say yes. And also, I have to say that yes was all the easier given the goals of the Center on Community Safety, Policing, and Inequality, to come up with innovative approaches to police governance, to shift power to communities, and to rethink public safety. In short, the goals are basically what I write about. So with your permission, I'm going to offer my thoughts on these topics. And then I'll conclude by saying a few words about legal education. So first, I want to say a few words about a topic that is too often pushed to the side or scorned even when it comes to discussions of community safety, policing, and inequality. And that topic is technology. So for some years now, I have been speculating about how advances in technology might actually increase community safety and lead to more egalitarian policing. I've been thinking about how technologies can even reduce police use of force, especially against those of us who are Black and brown. In short, one thing I want to do, and one focus of my scholarship in recent years, has been to encourage communities that experience the brunt of unequal policing to think seriously about what technologies might benefit them. Are there technologies out there that can address persistent problems? First, focusing on community safety, before we dismiss these technologies as dystopian and big brother run amok, we should think long and hard about whether we can harness technology to contribute to a reduction in crime. So consider the technologies we already have and the future technologies we could easily imagine because they're right around the corner. So usually when we think of surveillance cameras or eye in the sky technology or the use of facial recognition technology or other biometric surveillance tools, we think of how flawed these technologies are and we rail against them. But maybe we should also think about how these technologies can be improved upon, how we could sort of iron out the wrinkles, and how then they might contribute to public safety in a way that's not discriminatory. So consider those same technologies I just mentioned, but this time without the flaws. And now add to them, the likely instantaneous access to big data that law enforcement officers could have. Imagine the use of remote scanners to scan for people carrying unlawful firearms. Think about the likely availability of short-range communication technologies that obviate the need for traffic stops. Like we don't really need, even now, police to conduct traffic stops. Or even think of the future of self-driving cars, which will also obviate the need for traffic stops. Think about machine learning. All of this quite likely can contribute to deterring criminal activity and improving apprehension of those criminals who do engage in illegal activity. And I know, again, all of this may sound frightening, but before I sort of address that argument, consider something else. Such technologies have the potential to reduce unjustified police violence. So surveillance cameras likely already deter some police misconduct, but imagine what happens when we add other technologies. For example, I mentioned scanners. If a scanner can tell the police where the suspect is armed or not, that might actually reduce the need for officers to use excessive force or deadly weapons. Access to big data combined with facial recognition might tell the police whether somebody has a history of nonviolence, again, reducing the risk of escalation and the risk of violence. Future technologies will likely also enable police to disable weapons from a distance. Moreover, all of these technologies leave a data trail to create more accountability on the back end. I also want to mention a discussion Professor Brennan and Marquez were having the other day about predictive policing and algorithms and risk assessment tools. And Professor Brennan Marquez mentioned, like, imagine if we flip the script and use the same tools to predict which police officers have the highest risk in engaging in unjustified uses of force. And I hope I'm not, like, mischaracterizing our discussion. But again, the central point is, before we dismiss these technologies out of hand, we should think seriously about how these technologies might benefit us. Finally, I have been exploring how technologies can help de-racialize policing and make it more egalitarian. After all, cameras do not have implicit biases or suffer from unconscious racism. Technology may be able to move us closer to real, reasonable suspicion, so that looks, encounters, stops, and frisk turn on actual reasonable suspicion rather than the proxy of race. As I've written in one of my articles a while back, weapon scanners could potentially tell police that the bulge in a Black teenager's pocket is nothing more than a bulky cell phone, but that the white tourist who looks like he's from Texas really does have a gun. Facial recognition technology with access to big data would tell the police that the brown driver repeatedly circling the block, in fact, works in the neighborhood and is probably looking for parking, and that the clean-cut white guy sitting on the park bench is, in fact, a registered sex offender too close to the playground. In a way that's not intrusive, it would tell the police whether someone is a troublemaker casing a neighborhood or a student returning home with a bag of Skittles and an iced tea, a burglar about to commit a home invasion robbery, or a Harvard professor entering his own home, a thug with a gun or police chief, a trespasser attempting to enter the Capitol building or a US senator, a mugger looking for his next victim or future US attorney general. And it would tell them, and by the way, all of these examples are based on real life examples, and it would tell them that the white kid with Jersey plates, or let's do Connecticut plates, driving into, say, Bloomfield, a mostly Black neighborhood, is not there to score drugs, but there to see his Black girlfriend. So allow me to say a few more words on policing and technology, because this is often where I get some pushback. Some of the technologies I'm envisioning may sound privacy diminishing. But again, the point is to imagine how communities can harness these technologies and other technologies to reduce racialized policing, to make policing more egalitarian, and yes, to reduce crime. I recognize the current technologies are not racially neutral. I recognize too that technology has been anything but an innocent bystander when it comes to mass incarceration. The sociologist and futurist Ruha Benjamin at Princeton has even coined the term the new Jim Code, a play on Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, to warn that technologies can perpetuate and exacerbate inequalities, especially when they have the veneer of being free from human influence and bias. But none of this suggests that bias technologies are inevitable. Biases can be identified and eradicated, or at least minimized. People are constantly bringing up facial recognition technology, for example, and the difficulty with recognizing Black faces. That's because of the inputs. It's because of who's creating the technology. So guess what, everybody? Facial recognition technology developed in Asia has trouble recognizing white faces. It's not the technology, it's who's creating the technology. And once we sort of fix that, we can sort of address a lot of the problems that people see. So what I'm imagining is not a top-down approach to technology, but a bottoms-up approach. And it's about imagining the benefits that will flow when communities that are most police have the agency to produce technology, or at least to influence what technology gets adopted and what technology gets made. So those are my thoughts on policing and technology, but I think implicit in a lot of my discussion so far is probably another topic. We do not do enough to ask heavily police communities or high crime communities what would make them safe. And I would love to talk more about that in the Q&A, but given the time, I also want to say a few words about legal education, especially when it comes to criminal law. So I'm going to switch to legal education. As you can imagine, I've been on many panels these last few years about how to add race to the 1L curriculum, including to criminal law. And I have to admit that I'm always taken aback when I meet professors who do not discuss race when they teach criminal law. Honestly, when most people ask me how I bring race into my criminal law course, I'm inside usually scratching my head wondering, how does one not bring it in? How do you think about retribution and what punishment somebody deserves, and not discuss how desert can be tainted by notions of racial privilege and racial tax, as McCleskey v. Kemp, the death penalty case, and so many other cases make clear? How do you discuss the practicalities of how fact finders determine mens rea without acknowledging the role of racial privilege and racial tax play? How do you discuss rape without noticing the role race has historically played? In fact, without noticing that in most criminal law case books, the only victims in the chapters on rape are white women. So, I was recently on a panel where I said that when it comes to criminal law, race is the elephant in the room. And one of my fellow panelists, Andrew Crespo, corrected me, or at least offered a friendly amendment. He said, race is the room, and I agree. So one piece of advice I have for, especially for the students, I think listening into the Zoom, is insist that your professors acknowledge how much race is the room, or at least the elephant in the room. There's something else I want to say about criminal law and legal education, and it's really about my own evolution. When I first started teaching criminal law several years ago, I'm not going to say how long, my aspiration, I hoped some of my students would become prosecutors, like I used to be a prosecutor. I hoped other of my students would become defense lawyers. I hoped some would become judges, but basically my hope was that they would practice criminal law. As I get older, the more I sort of am on board with the idea that the criminal system is so flawed that I think sort of teaching criminal law as a given is a little bit problematic. It's almost like we are teaching students how to make changes at the margins, like how to get an acquittal here and there, how to get a conviction here and there, but not how to really challenge the system or to change the system. So my other advice for students listening in is to encourage your professors that you want to learn more about how the whole system might be changed. And for the faculty listening in, I encourage you to sort of think about that when you teach your classes. My final remark is this, and it's really for the center. There is one thing that I think is crucial to criminal justice, if we're going to call it justice, and to any center on community safety, policing, and inequality. And that one thing is listening to defendants. And to illustrate what I mean by that, allow me to mention a story I heard on NPR a few months ago. The NPR story was about Richard Rivera, a community board member of the Reimagining Public Safety Collaborative in upstate New York. And the idea behind the collaborative was to bring various stakeholders to the table to discuss ways to reform policing in response to the killing of George Floyd and the national Black Lives Matter protests that followed. What sparked my interest about the story was not so much the work of the collaborative, but the backlash following Richard Rivera's appointment to the group. The reason for the backlash was not about his views, but about him. Quite simply, Rivera was a convicted felon. Even worse, his conviction was for killing an off-duty police officer. It mattered little that Rivera had committed this crime 40 years earlier when he was just 16 years old, and that the shooting was unintentional, the result of an unplanned robbery gone bad. Nor did it matter that Rivera had done his time by serving 39 years in prison, and that he had turned his life around, and that he was now an outreach coordinator at a program for the homeless in Ithaca, New York, or that he was appointed to the collaborative precisely because of, not in spite of, his background. The hope was he would bring in voices not normally considered. As he noted during the NPR interview, my connections with the community that I work with, the most vulnerable and at-risk groups in Ithaca, allows me to speak to them. I think the voices of those that are most directly impacted and are least likely to participate in the discourse would be included. But this mattered little to the people who opposed his appointment. What mattered was that he was a convicted felon and one that had killed a police officer. He was not supposed to have a voice. He was not supposed to have a say. So one of the things that I really want us to think about is what we lose when we don't have people who've broken the law at the table, and we're trying to think about safety, community safety going forward. We certainly lose learning what caused them to commit crime in the first place. What were some of the drivers that led them to criminal activity? I also believe that when we refuse to listen to defendants, when we silence them, we're surrendering some of our humanity as well. But I'm happy to speak more about that during the Q&A. But since I really want to, hear what Justice Richard Palmer has to say and the students have to say, I think I'm going to end it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Capers. It's a real pleasure to have you speak, and your remarks were very, very interesting and provocative and appreciated. So I'm tempted to give you the opportunity to answer the one question that you indicated you wanted asked, specifically about what can communities do to make themselves safer. So I will give into that temptation and ask you to say a few words about that right now. You're muted.
Sure. So I think it's important to actually find out from communities what safety means to them, like what they think would help them with safety. And that could mean a variety of things. That could mean what tools law enforcement should use to investigate crime and to solve crime. But it could also mean what would actually improve their lives in terms of what's even considered criminal and what crimes they want officers to focus on. One of the dirty little secrets that we don't seem to talk about enough in this country is the fact that 1 in 3 homicides in this country goes unsolved. That's true across the board. It's pretty true in white neighborhoods. It's even more true in high crime neighborhoods. Probably everybody on this Zoom has had something stolen. Maybe they've had an apartment broken into or something like that. When we think about the number of property crimes that go unsolved, again, the numbers just keep going up. And yet, we have officers in communities, like, for example, in New York, we have communities who stop people for jaywalking. We have officers who stop people for riding their bikes on the subway. It may be that when we go to communities, they're like, we have domestic violence going on that we want you to address. We have sexual assaults going on that we want you to address. If a kid is selling drugs from his apartment, we don't care as much about that as like the crime of violence that's happening 2 doors down. So often with our criminal justice system, it's a very top-down approach. So it's basically the police sort of deciding what crimes they're going to pursue, prosecutors deciding which crimes they're going to prosecute. And often there's a disconnect between what those entities want and what communities want. The other thing we have to acknowledge that we don't do enough of is the disconnect between communities and prosecutors' offices. I mean, there's always sort of discussion like, oh, we should have more officers living in the communities they serve. And yet we're sort of comfortable with the idea that prosecutors are sort of this elite group, very distant, very removed, and often have no connection to the communities where they're engaged in a lot of prosecutions. And I mean that both in terms of no connection in terms of where they live, but also no connection in terms of things like race or class, anything like that. Professor Brennan Marquez mentioned I was a federal prosecutor for close to a decade. Let's be honest, I was in the office in the Southern District of New York for close to a decade that had approximately 178 prosecutors and never had more than 7 Black prosecutors the whole time I was there. And well, I could go on and on, but I will stop there.
Well, one of my questions to you was going to be, as a former prosecutor myself and now as a judge, I'm interested, and I think others might be interested to hear what you think, generally speaking, key participants like that, those in particular, in the criminal justice system can play in advancing the goals of fair, just, and effective policing. So I'll give you an opportunity to expand on your answer if you like, just for a second or two.
So when you say, do you mean community members or others?
No, I was thinking more of actually, well, that too. I think one of the fellows will be asking you about that. But in particular, prosecutors and judges, what can they do to advance those goals?
So, there's always a lot of discussion about the rise of the progressive prosecutor in this country, and that depending on one's persuasion, that's often celebrated. Progressive prosecutors, that might happen in blue jurisdictions. It's not going to happen throughout the rest of the country. That being said, I wish prosecutors would think long and hard about which crimes they prosecute and why, and think about the long-term consequences. So to make this very concrete, and again, since I love talking about myself, apparently, I'll be honest, the whole time I was a prosecutor, I was unaware that I was contributing to mass incarceration. And when I've spoken to colleagues who were in the office with me, we were unaware. That was like, it wasn't even on our radar. And it would be great if more and more prosecutors were looking at the big picture. And it's actually influenced how I teach criminal law. So I mentioned earlier, like I used to teach saying like, oh, hope some of my students become prosecutors, hope that some become defense lawyers. Increasingly, my hope is if they practice criminal law, if they decide to become a prosecutor, their goal is to become the district attorney, where they could actually play a role in setting policy. And the same with defense work. They'll become the public defender, because I think that's where real change is possible. We need to think seriously, do we do more harm or good if we send somebody to prison for like 20 years for a drug offense? What does that do to communities? What are the collateral consequences? How do we balance all of that when we think about what is just and what is right?
And I suppose that one primary way that judges can play a role is to kind of consistently review and revisit their sentencing policies.
Absolutely. And Justice Palmer, I don't know if you've been following the recent sort of story in New York about, the governor is about to appoint somebody to the New York Court of Appeals, and there's a movement. It's not quite a big movement, but there's a movement to have the governor appoint a former public defender, because let's be honest, when judges who oversee criminal trials tend to have a prosecution background, not a defense background. So there's so many things we could do to sort of change things and hopefully make them better.
In Connecticut, one thing that the state has done recently to try to make, improve policing generally is its 2020 Police Accountability Act. And that did a lot of things. I didn't really, frankly, realize how kind of thoroughgoing it was until I looked at it more carefully in the last few days. Highlights include, reform of the police certification and decertification process, mandating behavioral health assessments for police officers, and including implicit bias training, limitations on the governmental immunity defense, creation of the Office of Inspector General to investigate and prosecute cases involving the unjustified use of force, narrowing the justified use of deadly physical force, mandating that officers intervene and report in the use of excessive force by other officers, banning consent searches, virtually banning them altogether of automobiles and individuals, mandating the studies to evaluate feasibility and potential impact of using social workers to respond to calls for assistance or accompany police officer on certain calls. And there's a good bit more. Not surprisingly, there are law enforcement officials, police in particular, at one end, and civil liberties advocates on the other, who have really divergent views about the import, significance, value of these reforms. How do you think we can move forward in Connecticut or elsewhere in this area in a way that finds sort of a reasoned balance between these competing interests? Or is it not possible?
Oh God, great question. I don't even know if that is possible, because the usual, as you well know, the usual response whenever there's any attempt at a reform like this is, the police have a way of pointing to higher crime rates, which always seem to coincide almost conveniently with when there is a movement for reform. I think all we could do right now, and I'm thinking of Connecticut, is look and see what happens in the next several years, in the next several months. Because that's the proof is in the pudding. And it's very easy to make a reform and then see a rollback. When crime rates apparently go up. So, but this sounds great. This sounds great.
I think I fully agree with you. You put it better than I would have, but I think that traditionally, when reforms have been put in place, and police in particular, other law enforcement officials, and I've been there, opposed them. Very often, given some time to accustom themselves to the various reforms, it turns out that not only do they accept them, but eventually they actually embrace them. Recording confessions taken by the police as an example, which is now mandatory in Connecticut as a general matter. There's reform about eyewitness identification procedures in Connecticut that were put into place 6 or 8 years ago. And it's interesting because you speak to police and prosecutors now, and they're delighted because the identifications are rarely subject to challenge in court, or at least not successfully. And same with confessions. So I fully agree with your point.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction that something will either make conviction harder or prosecution harder. And often these things just have to play out. I think people should try to do reform in good faith, but also it's like, let's see what happens. So
yeah. This is another rather controversial subject, but something tells me you haven't shied away from controversy that much over the course of your career. This is a question involving the so-called defunding of police. One prominent advocacy group here in Connecticut is stated recently, and I quote, "Accountability measures alone are not enough. Connecticut must also divest from policing and reinvest in programs that build strong and safe communities. Policymakers must reduce policing's responsibilities, scale, and tools to build an equitable future for all people in Connecticut. What general reaction do you have to that?
So I'll tell you my general reaction to a lot of defund the police arguments, which is, I don't know, I discuss this with my students in class. It's almost like the messaging could be a lot better. Defund has a nice ring to it, but it's not a helpful ring. And investing and reinvesting, anything that has a more positive spin usually has more traction. But it would be great if we could get everyone to think about, well, do we really need police officers conducting traffic stops, for example? Do we need police officers with guns conducting traffic stops? And it's amazing when you look at fatalities, civilians, police killings. It's amazing the number that originate with traffic stops that are usually for something nonviolent, just escalates. It's also interesting. Well, I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but yeah, we should think, as a lot of people do, whether we want officers responding to mental health crises, whether we want them doing traffic stops, or whether there are other entities that would be more appropriate that don't have sort of the hammer of the causal system. And I think increasingly, so Judge Palmer, as you probably guess, I'm with a lot of my work, I'm often thinking, well, what would my ideal world look like? And in my ideal world, it's not just the police change or prosecutors, but it's also like society changes. Right now, we're a society where, depending on where you live, and this raises a whole other thing, depending on where you live, like if the people in the apartment above you make too much noise, you call the police. I will tell you where I live. If the people above me make too much noise, I call the co-op manager. Things just handled very differently. But we've become a society where 911 is often the default in a way that it probably shouldn't be. There's so many things where we almost internalize the idea of police involvement in things where historically, if we went back in time, we wouldn't have the police involved in as much as we do now. So in my ideal world, there's much more of community involvement, family involvement, friends involvement, and us keeping each other safe.
Apropos of your point about it depends on the communities and such, it turns out that the Connecticut Bar Association Policing Task Force, which just issued a report a few weeks ago, and it's really well worth reading, makes a number of recommendations in addition to the Accountability Act that was passed. But one of a couple of facts that struck me, and I guess I wasn't shocked by them, but it's consistent with the point you're making, that nearly half of the people who were either subjects or victims of the use of fatal force were struggling with a mental health condition. And tragically, one half were Black or Hispanic. And it turns out that 6 departments around the state were responsible for over one half of those incidents. So the points you're making are really very well taken, and I think are borne out by the statistics.
And I know we're about to bring in the students, but I just also have to give a shout out to Professor Jamila Morgan, who used to teach at UConn, who has devoted her short career to disability issues and police violence. And she's really brought this to the attention of law professors. I think it was just invisible to a lot of us. I mean, people see a race problem with victims of police violence, but there's also a mental health problem as well.
Good, thank you. I think this would be a good time to bring in the student fellows, as you mentioned. I'll ask them to come on board. There we go. Good. I think we're all here. If I might just ask you to go around and just introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryce Simmons. I am a second year at UConn Law and a fellow to the center. Justice Palmer and Professor Capers, so happy to be here and to learn. And I've enjoyed the conversation thus far and look forward to continuing it.
Okay, thank you. Shane?
Hi, thank you. Yep, Shane Russell. I'm a 3 UConn Law. I'm also a current police officer in Connecticut, so I hope I could bring a good perspective to this conversation. And then both of you, Justice Palmer and Professor Bennett Capers, thank you both for being part of this event.
And hello, everybody. My name is Mumina. I'm a 2L here at UConn Law, and I'm also a fellow at the center. I've enjoyed the conversation thus far, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion.
Thank you, and so am I. So am I. And let's start with Bryce, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about one of the first things you talked about, which was the idea of policing and technology. You kind of got ahead of me with some of the pushback points, which are, we do have the ability to humanize technology and to eliminate or reduce bias and those sort of things you mentioned, the surveillance state, facial recognition, autonomous driving vehicles. But my question really is, how do we view the role of policing and how do we evolve this role in our technological society, which is making policing more efficient and accurate? And with this sort of wealth of technology knocking on the door, even if we only are arresting or criminalizing people who have committed crime, is there a point at which perfect policing or perfect enforcement of criminal law is antithetical to the goals that we have? And I think this touches on what you were talking about with community safety and what does it actually take to make our community safe. But yeah, any thoughts you had on that would be great.
So great question. And first of all, I have to say, you guys all look so like professional. And here I am in my like casual, like, red sweater, just because I'm kind of cold in my office. So great question. I think what I'm envisioning is lots of checks and balances when it comes to communities, policing, and technology. So one thing I've talked about in my work, this doesn't quite answer your point, but I think it's connected. One thing I've talked about in my work is doing like race audits of new technologies to again, like see if there's still wrinkles, to see if there are disparate impacts. One thing I talk about is to make sure the distribution of technology is equally distributed. So when I mention surveillance cameras, I'm talking about surveillance cameras everywhere, not just in poor neighborhoods. But how do we avoid the risk of sort of like criminalizing too much with the all-seeing eye? And I think maybe the reason I'm mentioning sort of race audits is I can imagine communities stepping in and sort of saying, okay, well, that we don't care about that. That's not where our priority is. So that should not be on anybody's automated radar. Let's put it that way. I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, but that's all I got right now.
No, absolutely. No, it does. That makes sense.
Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, Professor. Shane?
Sure. My question is, you kind of touched on it earlier when you talked about how you call the police in your co-op when there's a noise complaint, where many people, I mean, you call your co-op manager when there's a noise complaint in your co-op instead of the police. And that gave me like flashbacks and nightmares, because all of the time I think police are sitting in their cruisers and we get these calls, and I've been on so many noise complaints, just that, and they call the police. They call 911 for the noise complaints. People call the police for things that aren't necessarily police matters, but somehow police have gotten that on their table. So my question is, we are kind of talking past each other, I think, in a lot of these ideas. And I think if you spoke with police officers, a lot of police officers would be on board with a lot of this stuff. But we've kind of trended the opposite way in this last year, where police have been like backing off and disengaging from the conversation. And it kind of goes to Justice Palmer's point, where the rhetoric is just ratcheted up so high, and their slogans and stuff is just radioactive to the point where you can't even have a discussion now about anything reform without forcing people away from the table. So I guess my question is, how do we move towards like a more cooperative, collaborative effort where everyone's at the table, whether it be defendants, police, policymakers, everyone, because inevitably when everyone's at the table, you get the best answers.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I should be asking you because you're a police officer. How do we, I mean, my guess is very slowly and very carefully. I've certainly either directly or indirectly been involved in enough sort of things where people are supposed to come together at a table where it doesn't even seem like a table, and it doesn't even seem to be coming together. It's more like, okay, the representatives from the police office are going to speak today, and then tomorrow we're going to hear what the community has to say, and it's people speaking past one another. I mean, it's probably, like trying to organize any summit, like start off with common ground. What can we agree on? Like, it would be interesting to me, because I don't know, but if it turns out police officers do not want to respond to loud noise complaints, that might be good to know. Like, we could actually sort of like, create some kind of like common ground around that. I think the perception is, though, that police actually like responding to any small thing because it allows them a foot in the door. It allows like a free look to see if there's contraband around. It somehow fits into the whole other part of policing that they want to do. And then the other thing I should just say, just to add more context about people calling police and not calling the police. The other thing is, in lots of poor communities, Black and brown communities, people don't resort to civil litigation the way they would sort of in a more affluent community. So, in my building, people would also sue each other, whereas, that's not even an option because a lot of people don't even know about that option, let alone have the wherewithal to hire a lawyer. So, complicated things, but back to your point, how do we bring police and community members to the table? I think, again, just very slowly and carefully. And it could start off, we do all these other things like, police are out there playing basketball with people in the community as part of their building community stuff. Start from there, just keep spreading out, just keep going in the right direction rather than people sort of getting into their own corners. And the same thing is true when it comes to stuff like police violence. So often with police violence, people historically, like, police will immediately okay, this is our position before all the evidence is in, and the community will be like, that officer should be arrested or at least fired before all the evidence is in. And if we could get to a point where everybody's like, okay, let's just calm down a moment, look at the evidence. And maybe if we all look at the evidence, we might be able to get a little bit on the same page. We might not agree 100%, but it might not be as diametrically opposed as it often is. So Shane, you are too young to remember New York City in the 1990s, whenever there was a police shooting, basically that very minute, the mayor at the time would take the news and sort of say this was completely justified, and it was just absurd.
Shane, if you have a follow-up, I was just going to very quickly make a couple of points. One is that there's the accountability bill passed last year contains a position or creates a position of Inspector General, and that person is tasked now with investigating and if necessary prosecuting cases of the use of excessive force or unjustified deadly force by police officers. The person who was appointed to that position, his name is Bob Devlin, who's a former prosecutor and a former judge, just recently retired, and an old colleague of mine in both capacities, in my view, is a terrific person and very, very fair-minded and thoughtful, and doesn't come with any agenda except to advance the office in a way that's appropriate. So I think that may help, an independent person who is not from the chief prosecutor. Well, technically he's in the chief prosecutor's office, but he's fully independent of the chief state's attorney. I think that's one. I think that's it's at least a modest improvement, or significant in itself, and modest, from the larger picture. One other thing too, you talk about police perhaps not wanting to spend as much time on matters that they are required to. They're not really police matters. I think that's true of the criminal justice system as a whole. People end up in that system being prosecuted and sometimes pleading guilty or being convicted based on conduct that really it's more related to mental health or addiction or other things, and has very little. There may be a crime in there someplace, but treating that person as a criminal is not likely to do much good for anybody, the individual, the community, or anybody else. So I didn't mean to stop you from following up, so please go right ahead.
No, those are both awesome points, and I agree with a lot of what you said. Just one point I'll make before I pass it to Mamina. Maybe some of my colleagues are on this call too, because I invited everyone. But I have been advocating that when there's a high profile officer involved shooting, and you touched on it, Professor Capers, that the reflexive nature is to always back the police officer, because there's always the implicit well, what if that was me? I want that backing too. But my position is you need to really just take the time and 2 seconds and just scrutinize it and figure out what's going on, because as police officers, we only have so many so much it looks bad, but trust me, capital, and we need to save that for the matters that really trust me, it looks bad, but if you look at it, it's justified. So I've been advocating that myself within my own circles, but I'll pass it to Amina for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Amina?
Hello, Professor Capers. So my question kind of tracks what you talked about in regard to the curricula in law school. And so after reading your piece, Law School as a White Space, that piece really spoke to me personally, and I really related to a lot what you said. But one of your central arguments were why law schools sort of function as a white space was really focused, like you said, on the curricula, and particularly on the 1L curricula. And so sort of the substantive and non-substantive ways the curriculum is sort of taught is aimed at sort of transforming the student into this legal thinker. But that sort of concurrently requires the student to disengage with the socio-racial epistemology of some of these legal doctrines and concepts. And so this is one of the things that the center is sort of aimed at, is refining the JD curriculum to be sort of more exacting on that legal education for students. And so since you mentioned criminal law in your lecture, and that's what you teach, is the best way to reimagine the curricula through sort of interconnected conversations about concepts as they go? Is it sort of a class at the beginning of the semester, sort of informing students about that sort of socio-cultural context at the beginning of a lecture, or is it some sort of other way that I haven't mentioned? And more generally, what is the role you see of a center like our center as an arm of a law school sort of play in reimagining what law schools look like?
So great question. So on the second point, I would imagine the center, well, I will tell you how I use my own center at Fordham, which is sometimes I think of it as a supplement to the education students are getting in their classes. So it's bringing up sort of things that might be entirely missing from what they're learning doctrinally. So I'm always a fan of that. And then on your first point, I could speak to how I've been teaching, and I'm glad you mentioned my forthcoming article, because I have to say, since I wrote that, I've actually noticed that I've been teaching differently. It's almost like by writing that article and sort of saying how we teach needs to change. It was oh, maybe I should change more how I teach. So one of the things I said in that article, and for the people in the audience, at the end of the article, Judge Palm, I'm always imagining the future. I imagine what my ideal law school would look like. And one of the things I imagine is at least the school is thinking about taking courses out of their predictable silos and having much more give and take and flow between different subjects. And I've noticed this year that when I've been teaching criminal law, like the first couple of classes, sure, I had this like syllabus I was supposed to follow, but my students just started asking questions about the criminal system. And their questions were so good and so important. And they were so fundamental, like, that I was like, okay, let's just keep going with this. So in a way, like the first two classes, it was just like, students just want to know, like, well, how does that work? How does this work? You know, and trust me, in criminal law, you're not learning about double jeopardy, but, you know, it came up in my class, you know, it's just asking like, you know, how the system works. And I think I almost found myself going back to the whole idea of law schools, you know, lawyers started off, before we had law school, we had the apprentice system basically. And think about how you learn anything outside of school. Like you just hang out with somebody and you learn, you ask questions and you learn. And it's such an organic way of learning that's one thing I do. And I think just bringing in like class and race and sexuality and privilege just flow naturally for me. So that's all I can say. I can say how I do it, but as you can tell from even this, like I'm always just myself. So
thank you. I mean, do you have a very quick follow-up question or?
No, I was going to just say I really
Oh.
appreciate your response, and I definitely agree that it sort of should track the real world and the sort of dynamicism in these conversations. And so thank you for your response.
I want to send, we're basically running out of time, so I want to send this back to Professor Brennan Marquez. I want to thank all of you, myself personally. It's just been a wonderful experience. But before I do, I have one last quick question for Professor Capers, and that is, what friendly advice or counsel would you give the center as it moves forward on its on this new journey that it's undertaken?
It's to stay true to the goals of the center. Don't get sidetracked. And at bottom, the center, I'm assuming, is about, again, changing policing, changing community safety. But I also believe every center should also be student focused. So for me, one of the best things about delivering this address is having student involvement. That's not to take anything from you, Judge Palmer, but you know, I love it whenever students are involved in anything.
You haven't hurt my feelings at all. Thank you. I'm going to, as I said, kick it back over to Professor Brennan. There we are.
Yeah. I just want to, say thank you for such a terrific discussion. Thank you to the audience members. We're putting a little information in the chat, just directing you to the website if you want to learn more. It's in all the RSVP emails, and it's easily available on Google, etc. So please do, as I said in my opening remarks, get in touch, stay in touch. We really want to hear from you. And this has just been tremendous. So I'm gonna clap for the speakers, and everyone's clapping at home, even though you can only hear mine. And thank you so much for attending.